this lecture, we will consider changing patterns of ethnonational identification and language use in wartime Ukraine. We will see how the full-scale war urged Ukrainians not only to identify more strongly with the Ukrainian nation and its perceived national language, but also to use more Ukrainian in everyday life. Let me first say a few words about the main concepts. I understand identity as a socially constructed and situationally variable self-perception of an individual in terms of his or her belonging to certain groups or categories. In other words, people's self-perception as, say, females, lesbians, or workers emerges under the influence of prevalent discourses and practices in a given society and becomes more or less meaningful and salient in particular situation of social interaction. Changes in a certain identity, for example, Ukrainian, can be analyzed both in terms of its salience vis-a-vis other identities a person has, and in terms of its content or the particular meaning attached to his or her perceived belonging to this category. Of all identities Ukrainian citizens may have, I will analyze their self-perception as Ukrainians, keeping in mind that this notion can have both ethnic and civic meanings, as well as some mixture of the two. When Ukrainians did not have their own statehood and were just one of many ethnic groups in the multinational empires, they primarily understood the word Ukrainian in ethnic sense. Although many people categorized as Ukrainians thought of themselves first and foremost as members of groups defined by other criteria, such as religion, social status, and the place of residence. Apart from perceived descent, an important criteria of Ukrainianness was language. Although millions of ethnic Ukrainians in the USSR came to speak primarily Russian in both public and private domain, the large majority retained the identification with Ukrainian as their native language. Accordingly, this indicator ceased to be an adequate measure of language practice, but retained the value as a measure of language identity. Since the establishment of an independent state, the word Ukrainian has increasingly acquired a civic meaning, namely that of a citizen of the Ukrainian state, similar to the predominant perceptions of membership in other independent nations such as American or French. At the same time, the ethnic sense persists and coexists with the civic one, with different people prioritizing different meanings. Therefore, we can say that Ukrainian identity is both ethnic and national. The same pertains to the self-reported Ukrainian nationality. Although the category of nationality was designed by the Soviet regime as strictly ethnic, in independent Ukraine, it has acquired a strong civic component. What particular people or particular categories of people mean when they say they're Ukrainian or Ukrainian by nationality needs to be studied rather than posited. Turning to empirical data, let us begin with the salience of Ukrainian national identity compared to other territorially anchored identity, from local to global. For years, sociologists inquired about the salience by asking respondents, who do you consider yourself primarily? While the self-perception as a Ukrainian citizen was the most salient already in the early 2000s, it was prioritized only by 40% of respondents. Since then, the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan significantly boosted national identity, but the greatest upsurge occurred in result to Russia's full-fledged invasion in February 2022. In a survey conducted later that year, the identification as a Ukrainian citizen was reported as primary territorial identification by fully 83% of respondents. Remarkably, while after Euromaidan and Russian aggression of 2014, Ukrainian identity was much less salient in the east and south of the country than in the west and the center, in 2022, the regional differences have all but disappeared. Another demonstration of the war-induced upsurge in Ukrainian identity comes from the responses to the survey questions on nationality and native language. In the final years of the USSR, the 1989 census revealed that 73% of Ukrainian citizens identified as Ukrainians by nationality, 22% as Russians, and 5% as members of other ethnic groups. Since the first years of independence, the share of self-reported Ukrainians has been growing, while that of people reporting Russian nationality has been declining. The first and only Ukrainian census conducted in 2001 showed an increase of Ukrainian nationality to 78% and the corresponding decrease of Russian nationality to 17%. After the Russian aggression of 2014, Russian nationality came to be widely associated with Russia and therefore avoided. After the full-fledged invasion of 2022, this process became even more intense. In a July 2023 survey, fully 95% of respondents reported their nationality to be Ukrainian and only 2% Russian. Moreover, the share of people adhering to Russian nationality dropped to just 3% in the south and 4% in the east, a stark contrast with the late Soviet situation where people of Russian nationality constituted more than a quarter of this region's population. Obviously, the increase of self-identified Ukrainians resulted from re-identification of millions of people who, or whose parents, used to consider themselves Russian. This confirms that the identification by nationality acquired a strong civic component. In the above-mentioned survey of July 2023, the share of respondents admitting to defining their nationality by the country they live in became higher than of those who reported the traditional ethnic understanding of nationality as a characteristic one inherited from one's parents. The identification with the Ukrainian language as native has undergone a similar transformation from the exclusive ethnocultural to partly civic. In the 1989 census, 65% of Ukraine's residents, declared Ukrainian as their native language, while 32% reported Russian. The share of people identifying with Ukrainian was thus much higher than that of people actually using it as their native language, as their main language, the latter being below 50% as revealed by surveys in the early 1990s. Moreover, since the first years of independence, the identification with Ukrainian started to grow. And after 2014, this growth became more rapid and expanded to the eastern and southern regions where most people continued speaking Russian, but reported that their native language was Ukrainian or both Ukrainian and Russian. After 2022, the attachment to the Russian language decreased dramatically. So in the 2023 survey, 83% of respondents identify with Ukrainian, 8% with Russian, and further 7% with both languages. Remarkably, even in the East, only 19% reported Russian, while fully 68% identify with Ukrainian. But unlike in 2014, Ukrainian citizens responded to Russia's full-blown invasion of 2022, not only by rejecting the identification with Russian as native language, but also by limiting their reliance on it in public and even private communication. In September 2020, 52% of respondents reported using primarily Ukrainian private domain, 27% primarily Russian, and 18% both languages equally. By July 23, the share of those reporting the primary reliance on Ukrainian rose to 65%, while only 13% said they were using mostly Russian. Even more surprisingly, in the eastern oblasts, the reported use of Ukrainian became as widespread as that of Russian, with both shares at 31%. While one might suspect that many people report the use of Ukrainian for the sake of social desirability, a consideration that may be particularly strong in time of war, an experiment embedded in our survey of July 23 demonstrated that the social desirability bias in responses to the question on language use is actually very small. Even a more radical shift from Russian to Ukrainian occurred in the language of work, where it was additionally facilitated by the requirement of the 2019 language law that Ukrainian be the default language of all public interactions. For years, Ukrainians used more Russian at work than at home. This means that despite Ukrainian being the sole official language, Russian remains the language of socio-economic power. Now the relation between the two practices is reversed, as some people have switched to Ukrainian at work in compliance with the law, while others have willingly embraced it for all public communication. In the 2023 survey, fully 73% of those respondents having a job reported using primarily Ukrainian at work, and only 9% primarily Russian. Even in the East, 43% say they use Ukrainian, while 28% reported Russian. The prevalence of Ukrainian at work is in accordance with the observed reality of language use in many big cities, including the capital, where many people still speak Russian in private communication, but use Ukrainian for public interactions with state officials, bank tellers, waiters, and taxi drivers. This differentiation of language preferences may become a new norm, at least in the near future, although it may happen that the predominant language of the public domain will eventually spill over into private communication.